Okay, I am going to just share the screen so we know where we are. So thank you all for being here. My name is Kamiko Haas. I'm the Director of Instructional Improvement Programs at the Center for Advancement of Teaching. And I am joined by my co-facilitators, Beth Goodhue, the Associate Director for Faculty Engagement, and Allison Fedina, our Programs Operation Coordinator both at CAT. I would like to welcome you all to the student panel session. Our panelists have been invited today to share with us their perspectives on how the pandemic has affected them as students and changes they saw in classes that they would like to see continue when we're hopefully soon be back in person. We have a few questions that we would like to ask panelists to respond to, but we always welcome comments and questions from the audience too. You could start putting them in the chat and we'll keep an eye on that as well. Along with, we'll have some time for open questions. So, what I'd like to do is I will go ahead and ask our panelists to introduce themselves and sort of to keep it moving. Once you're done, if you can popcorn it to the next person, that'd be great. So I'm going to start with Imani.
Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Imani Elston. I'm currently a first-year master's student in the Civil and Environmental Engineering department, and I also got my Bachelor's of Science degree in Civil and Environmental Engineering last June. Super excited to be here, and I'll popcorn to Jake.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jake. I'm a fourth-year marine biology major. I was also a part of UCLA's Learning Assistant Program for 4 quarters, and I'm currently a part of the WIRE team working with UCLA Library. And I'm going to pass it on to Jason.
Thanks, Jake. Hi, everyone. My name is Jason. My pronouns are he, they. I am a fourth-year Global Studies and Asian American Studies double major with a minor in linguistics. I am super excited to be here with you all. I've also served as a peer learning facilitator with the Academic Advancement Program, as well as being a student here. So I'm looking forward to our conversation together. I'll pass on to Ivana.
Thank you, Jason. My name is Ivana, and I'm currently a senior in Departments of Design, Media Arts, and my minor is in Digital Humanities. I'm a transfer student as well, and I was a part of undergraduate research scholars program, and I'm very excited to be here. I'm gonna pass it on to Lydia.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for coming. My name is Zilia and I'm a current 4th year, double majoring in physiological science and human biology and society. Like Jason, I'm also a peer learning facilitator for the Academic Advancement Program on campus.
Okay, thank you all. So as I said at the intro, we really are curious to hear from you directly about your experiences. And I think I'd like to start off with the positives. What are some of the things that your professors have done since we've gone remote that has worked well for you? If you can sort of chime in, anyone in particular want to jump in with that question?
Yeah, I can start off maybe. I think something that during this kind of online learning that I really appreciate from professors is I think more attention to, our break time kind of as a class. In particular, one of my professors it was a 3-hour seminar class, and like 3 hours on Zoom is like a lot. but I think something that she really made sure to integrate is like a time for us to not only have a break on our own, so like using the restroom, doing whatever we need to do, but we also had some time in class to do some stretches together. So she would lead a couple like stretching exercises just to get us out of our seats and moving, which I think is really helpful, not only, because we're sitting for like so long in a seminar class, but also it's a really nice way to build community with students. I feel like even though we're not talking to each other, after those stretches, we kind of, when we're coming back to class, we always message and we're like, oh, that was a nice stretch today. I feel like energized. It's a good way to get a temperature check for how the class is doing. And also, just getting out of the rhythm of just sitting there and talking at your Zoom boxes. So yeah, that's something that I've really appreciated. And I guess like in terms of how this would translate into in-person, like, I hope there's more intention in the kind of breaks we take, even when we're in person. We're still sitting a lot, so we still need those rest times.
I wanted to, although I didn't have experience of stretching on Zoom yet, I want to say that I really appreciate that a lot of professors are aware that not everyone can attend the classes at the same time. So they recorded the lectures, and I found that really helpful, even though I was attending the class in person, that I can go back and look at my notes and compare things, and especially as English is my second language. So sometimes even during the regular classes, I wasn't sure if I understood the right pronunciation or things like that. So I can go back and kind of take my time in looking the lectures in a slower way. And I hope that we can keep that even if we are not online, that some of these positive things can transfer in in-person classes or hybrid classes.
I would say one of my favorite things about how my professors have transitioned their teaching style would be shifting some of the focus from memorizing, maybe a little bit of regurgitation of very specific details, to more application based. So 2 of my classes did this really well. One of them was a society and genetics class, specifically on food studies. What we had to do is we had to create a project that was a podcast. So the entire quarter we worked together in groups, which is also nice since Zoom is very isolating, and if you facilitate group sessions within your course structure, then it makes it easier for students to feel connected with the material and their classmates. So anyways, every week we had projects together as a group that were due, and these little small assignments were working towards a larger project of making a podcast. And a podcast may sound like an odd way to assess students, but in reality, for the professor, she led us to understand the material in such a way that we would be able to talk about it in a teaching way or like an instructional way. And I do think that the best way for you to know if you know something is if you're able to teach somebody else. So that was one example that I really liked. Another one of my professors, instead of, and this was for like a Phi-Sci class. So society and genetics is a little bit more like interdisciplinary versus Phi-Sci is a lot more sciencey. So what this professor did is instead of having maybe like 2 midterms and a final, she had 3 sets of study questions. And she made these study questions very collaborative so that they were released at the beginning of each of the 3 modules. And we could work on them over weeks. And they were really difficult questions and they were all application focused. But because they were so challenging, it really promoted collaboration within students. I'm a big fan of collaboration instead of competition. So again, this course structure promoted students interacting with each other. And again, it's not the usual way of testing of like, here's like multiple choice, which is the way I was frequently tested for Phi-Sci. But it was like, hey, here's this scenario that you've never heard of. Use your knowledge from class to answer these questions. So personally, I really like this more engaging way of testing. Anyone else want to add anything?
I think something that I was able to take away from remote learning that I think would be pretty helpful moving forward is the use of weekly content quizzes. I know like that might seem like a little like, oh, like students aren't going to want more assignments during their weekly workload, but For one of the classes that I took, the weekly quizzes weren't time-based, and they weren't graded on correction in that you could retry the quiz as many times as you want. So it focused less on the stress of having to get the correct answer on your first try, and more about understanding the concepts that were learned during the week and kind of just really like drilling them in a sense, or, you know, taking away that element of being incorrect and, you know, the fear of being wrong, and rather just taking those concepts that you learned and kind of reviewing them week after week. And this way, you know, you kind of keep up with the content that's being taught every week, rather than, you know, you get like a couple of days before your midterm, you start cramming everything. This way, you know, it kind of keeps the students accountable in that they're actually keeping up with the material that's being taught.
And then I would add, on top of what everyone has said, definitely there were more frequent, I think, check-ins. You know, normally we're in person, we have that just at the end of the year, how'd the class go? But because we were all trying to figure it out, it was almost every 2 weeks or every 4 lectures, kind of, how are things going? Is everyone up to speed on the readings and stuff like that? That was, I think, huge to kind of constantly check the pulse. And then the other thing for me in classes that was helpful was kind of promoting working together on small assignments, like working together on homeworks, not just on projects. And everybody had to turn in their own assignment, but it was, you know, creating these spaces to kind of feel less isolated, kind of exactly what Lilia was saying before. But that's some of the positives I had from remote learning.
Another thing I want to add to Imani's comment is for one of my classes, at the very first session, the TA and the professor had a student activity where the class could or have the space to share their expectations for both the TA and the professor. And then we could choose which ones we wanted. And then at the same time, the professor and the TA could gave us a space to say like what we expected of ourselves. And then we had a conversation on like what was fair, what we wanted. And that has been one of the best classes I've taken at UCLA. And I wasn't necessarily interested specifically in the material, but I enjoyed it so much because it was ran so well. And a lot of the changes were maybe small in terms of logistical, but had a very big impact. For example, one of the terms we agreed on is that lectures would always be posted before lecture. Like the slides, PowerPoint slides would be posted before lecture. And that was important because now, since everything is remote, students have been moving more towards using like some type of tablet, like an iPad, to take notes. And if you have access to the PowerPoint slides ahead of time, you can download them and annotate on the slides directly. So small changes like that can have a huge impact. And it really helps for students to have that space.
So this is probably sort of along the same lines, but what were some of the challenges or difficulties that you faced, you know, being remote or being online, and how, what were some of the things that you felt that your faculty and instructors responded really well to, and how did they respond to that?
I can start by saying one of the biggest challenges, and I feel like I'm in a unique situation because I'm a master's student, so we were starting with a kind of new cohort of people, but at the same time, I had been at UCLA before. But one of the biggest challenges was kind of creating community. I think, you know, when you're in your upper division classes, you start to see the same people, so the names look familiar. But this was like being on a Zoom and not recognizing any faces. But I think one of the big things my professors did, especially in fall, because we're a cohort that travels together, is having a lot of icebreakers and breakout rooms without the instructor, that allowed for like kind of, you know, more open dialogue to be like, do you know what's going on? I have no clue, and not feel that extra pressure of, okay, you know, someone is listening in. That was a huge challenge that I think has been somewhat addressed. The other big thing, and I've talked about this, we talked about this before, was, we've recognized that in this pandemic, there are a lot of responsibilities that students have outside of school. And I think one of the best ways that my professors addressed that was shifting to the flipped classroom instruction, so that when we were online, we weren't just sitting and listening to lecture. It felt like, okay, back and forth conversation and discussions to be able to gauge that we were actually listening. And it made it, because we had the recorded lectures in advance, we could work around our different, outside obligations to be able to learn. So those were the challenges that I faced, and I think how the professors addressed it.
Thank you, Monty. Anyone else want to chime in on that question? Sort of along the same lines, a number of you have mentioned about sort of being on Zoom, being, very different atmosphere as in the classroom, feeling a little bit isolated. What are some of the things that you think that was very effective that your faculty had done to both know you as a student and also for give you the opportunity to get to know your fellow classmates?
Yeah, I can speak on this a little. I think something that one of my classes did that I think helped really with that kind of isolation of being on Zoom classes all the time, I think, is having creative group projects. And I say creative specifically because I think for me, and this is something I think other panelists can speak to as well, it's really important to have like the sense of wanting to do the same project, or kind of a project that is engaging and interesting to folks. So for my class, for example, our project was to come up with some kind of collective art piece or cultural work. What my group ended up doing was we made a zine, which is like a kind of like an online magazine where we each made a submission, like whether that be a poetry piece. I did a collage. Some people did like their own drawings. But it was all related to a theme. And that kind of allowed us to have conversations with one another about like kind of, the topics in the class, but also even more than that, just like the relevancy of the, I think the relevancy of kind of like, how our own personal experiences relate to the class, which helped us, I think, get over that kind of sense of isolation on Zoom. So that's what worked for me, I think.
I can add a little bit on the same topic as well. From my personal experience, I had a couple of classes where the groups are not assigned randomly. And then I had a lot of classes where it was, and it didn't really work for me, but the groups were selected based on the interest. So there were 5 topics, and you choose your topic, and you're with people who are passionate about the same topic. And you're working together with people who care about that specific thing. And this was for a business class, and we were trying to like create a startup business. And you really can't do that unless you're passionate about a specific topic. So that was really helpful to be with people who think not just like you. We're all from different disciplines, but it was just like kind of refreshing to be in a group that we're not randomly assigned, that we kind of not picked each other, but kind of came together for one reason.
To add on to both Jason and Ivana, one of my professors ended up doing a survey before the class actually started, and in the first lecture presented on the survey results. And the survey asked questions such as like, how many hours are you working per week? And when he presented on these like different like facts about our class demographics, it really helps students feel as if they're not alone. Because maybe if a student is working 20 plus hours a week, they may feel like they're the only ones. But to know like, I don't know, 50% of their classmates in that class specifically are also going through some situation, it makes them feel more connected. That same class also used those surveys to create class projects. So there was no group that had 4 or 5 people who were all working a ridiculous amount of hours, right? So to help balance certain things out. So I thought that was really helpful.
So I just wanted to follow up on that question because I really think that this is a really interesting topic because as someone who works with faculty to think about ways to engage students, we talk about group projects, but at the same time, I know that working with students and also with faculty who have heard from students that group work doesn't work, or students don't like group work. So just to hear these thoughts about what makes group work actually specifically better in this kind of remote environment is very reassuring. And hopefully this is something that will move on and carried over when we go back and into face-to-face. But sort of just to add to that, if you can use this opportunity to let us know what didn't you like about group work, or what are some situations that will prevent you from not liking the group work. And specifically, as you said, it was the being able to have something that was a little bit meaningful or creative. But what are some things that if you would like to let us know don't do in group work, that'd be great. Or we're just going to all assign group work to everyone.
I can start on this because I mentioned it last time too, but it's really difficult. Like in a School of Arts and Architecture, I took many classes in all 4 departments in School of Arts and Architecture. And a lot of students are either working on building their portfolio and working on specific interests and specific in their kind of throughout your time, and at least at design media arts department, I was building my own aesthetic sensibility. And group projects really didn't work for me because it always felt that someone in a group was suffering, that either your idea cannot be developed or that either your aesthetics cannot be pursued, that we are creating something that no one is really happy about and that we're just going to put on the side after the class is done. So I talked to all my friends, like not all of them, of course, but most of my friends. Every time we hear group project, we just like turn like our eyes and we're just like not happy about it. And I know some of them really well, and we feel comfortable to share these things with each other. And we even heard from new upcoming transfer students who are lost and kind of trying to find their own language. And then when you have later on in your career, everyone is asking you, oh, what exactly did you do in this group project? And you are presenting something and you're not sure about it or not happy about it. So for me, group projects worked really well in large classes, but in studio classes where there's only 10 students and you have groups of 3 students and that you're working on something specific, didn't really work well. Maybe I wasn't lucky yet to have that class. But yeah, I just had a feeling that group projects for me are either 100 or 0. So I haven't had like a okay group project. It was just either it was amazing experience where I met people and got engaged with them, or it was just okay, I can't wait to be done with this class. So yeah, I wanted to emphasize that.
I kind of want to agree with Ivana that maybe for some courses, the group project may not work as or nearly as well as other courses, but I do think that there are things that professors can do to help facilitate a successful group project. So some of the ideas that I've had based on like the last 2 quarters of online, where I've had a lot of group projects, would be to maybe one, if there are any tools that students may require in terms of technology, as in like using platforms, it might be useful for professors to upload Zoom videos or like find YouTube videos for students to look at so they can know how to use it and make their project work more efficient. 2, the second thing would be to maybe have part of the project be for each group member to make a project proposal, and then have them in breakout rooms discuss which one they like, what they don't like, and then submit a final proposal where all group members had the opportunity to discuss and vote on which one they wanted. And the third thing would be to break up the project. I guess it depends if it's like end of quarter project instead of a final, or even if it's just like in place of a midterm. Have the project broken up into different tasks, like very small tasks, just to help prevent the group from procrastinating. Since again, everything's online, a lot of students are working more hours than they maybe normally would, especially if one of their parents lost their position or if they are now caregivers. So it really helps to have it broken down into smaller chunks. And especially if the professor is facilitating that, then it's going to prevent students from doing that. And it's also going to help us catch when maybe one group member is significantly lagging or not contributing, because instead of it being caught at the end of the quarter when you're about to submit this project that's worth a big portion of your grade, it is caught earlier, maybe during week 1 or week 2 or during the first assignment. So those are the tips I have for all of you in terms of structuring a group project successfully.
I wanted to touch a little bit on the conversation that's happening in the chat, because I really love the point that Beth, Kathy, and Shauna brought up. I think definitely doing check-ins for group projects is a great way to make sure that, you know, the group work is going well, and, you know, it's also a great way for, you know, reflection on like how you can better improve like the group projects in the future. You know, for maybe longer term projects, maybe a couple check-ins if it's like a quarter-long project, maybe a couple check-ins in the quarter just to see, you know, how the process is going. If, you know, if there's any chemistry issues with certain group mates, maybe, you know, there could be some logistical things that students think might be better or might work better in the future. Maybe short-term projects, maybe it's like a couple weeks long, maybe an initial check-in, maybe, you know, like what do you hope to get out? Kind of like what I think Beth was saying, what do they hope to get out of the project? How do they imagine it going? And then maybe an end of the project reflection, what went well, what didn't. And yeah, maybe just an overall view of how they do things. I think check-ins are definitely a great way to make sure that group projects are going well and are helpful for the students.
And I might add on a little that I definitely agree those check-ins are good. And I think like a point that we were talking about earlier is kind of building also like a connection between not only between students, but also like instructors and students. And I think something that would be really cool is, you know, these check-ins can definitely be like a evaluation form or something. I also think though that like, you know, having some of these be done as like meetings, whether that be like, you know, with the entire group or one-on-one. I know like, of course, like, you know, faculty capacity, we don't want to like overstretch, but I think being able to have those meetings with students could be really valuable in terms of not only like learning how a group is doing, but also just building relationships with those students.
One final note that I want to touch on in group projects that I found really helpful last quarter was that my professor incorporated some of the project work during lectures. And it wasn't every lecture that we met up with our project, but usually on Fridays, we would meet in our group for maybe like 30 minutes. So it was taking up lecture time, but that was a final project. So it kind of allowed us to work together, especially with our conflicting schedules. And I know that might not work for all classes, but if there is space, it might be helpful to just allocate maybe like 10, 15 minutes for group members to kind of check in with each other, included in the, I guess, class syllabus.
Okay, thank you. So this kind of segues into my next question, sort of along the themes of, you know, what did you learn? What did you experience? This question is along the lines of, when we are hopefully soon, as I said, being able to get back in person, do you think that you would want to get back to how classes were structured the way before? Has this experience really changed things? And, you know, do you think that you would really want to see some of these techniques incorporated? If so, how? and this is in some ways a slightly difficult question, because I think most of you are going to, well, Imani is now starting her master's program, but I think everyone else is nearing graduation. But as a student, how do you think this has sort of changed your thoughts on how you individually as a student would approach, studying and things like that, but also would like to see your classes? Anyone want to tackle that question?
Thank you for that question. I think it's very complex, because I personally hope that we just don't go back to business as usual and let's just be a old UCLA while the world is totally different. So I personally learned that there was a lot of unnecessary, like my unnecessary trips to campus, and I can mention some of them, but I personally live in Topanga, which is about 40 minutes if you're lucky from UCLA. And most of the time it can be 2 hours because of traffic. And I caught myself multiple times driving about 4 hours to have 15 minutes office hour, or to have 1 hour long discussion session. And I had to go back home. And so it was more time spent in transportation, and also wasting the gas and all other things that are bad for our environment and planet too. So I think that just we now have the structure already built in. And so if we have to ask a quick question to a large lecture class professor, then we can do that over Zoom instead of having to drive all across the town just for that one question. Would be really helpful.
I think, Kumiko, that's a very difficult question to ask, but I think it's a very important one to try to answer. Just like an idea I had based on like what Ivana said is maybe at the professor's discretion, of course, potentially having some type of poll or survey to see if students would maybe want to have office hours be through Zoom or discussion be through Zoom. I think it's really powerful to give students the opportunity of choice. One thing that I really, really want to encourage all professors to maintain or incorporate, if they didn't incorporate it as much during our virtual or remote learning, would be collaboration. I really think that group projects, it's personally like helps me a lot, as well as testing that is more application focused than memorizing materials. In my experience, especially with physiological science, where there's a lot of like small molecules and networks, very cool things, but they're things that they're so detail oriented that I won't be able to remember a few months after I learn it. What I do remember and things that really stick with me are questions that I had that were application based, that made me think about the concepts. Those major concepts will stay with me for years, right? Versus the detail-oriented pathways that I had to memorize for an exam, I probably forgot about it like within a few months, unfortunately. Even though I'd love to remember it, it's just not something that has stayed with me. So I highly encourage collaboration and application-based testing. And one of the comments in the chat, I don't remember who said it, said more low stakes examinations versus a few high stake ones. I think that's also really good because it reduces student stress. And I think it was Imani who brought up that like there are a lot of different situations that students may be encountering, especially with the academic advancement program and like the peer learning unit. There are a lot of students who have parents who lost their jobs or who have been at home and have no desk. I had one student that came to sessions with me who had to either do a midterm from her bed or from her dining room table because she had no desk. So you can imagine how difficult it must be to have your family around you while you're trying to take a test. So one thing I also want to promote is professors being understanding. And a lot of them have done like a fantastic job during remote learning, but just maintaining that level of understanding when we transition back into campus in the fall.
I think for me, one thing that I would like to see going forward um, is maybe the integration of a few asynchronous lectures per quarter. So it doesn't necessarily have to be just like a main component of the course, but I think that maybe during those heavier weeks, you know, the middle of the quarter, around weeks 4 through 7, is when a lot of midterm examinations happen. And I also noticed that that's also when a lot of the students face the most burnout. I think maybe being aware that though that's a very busy time for a lot of students, and maybe potentially if you have a class that meets twice a week, maybe having one of those two meetings be a pre-recorded lecture that the students can watch on their own time. I know it may seem like it takes the engagement out of the lectures a little bit, but I know as a student looking back, I think I would have really appreciated, you know, having a little more time to, you know, do some of the high stakes assessments or midterms, but I think it'd be a great way to kind of combat that that burnout that, you know, we all see over Zoom, but I think it's a little easier to see over Zoom than it is to see during an actual school quarter. So I think maybe some sort of integration of that would be great during the normal quarter.
Thank you. I think what you just said in terms of sort of, in some ways, a lot of these things have been highlighted, but students are busy. They have, you know, a lot of stressors, and there's a lot of things that I think as faculty, you know, if we can incorporate, that will be really helpful for the students. I do find it really interesting that it almost seems like there's also kind of a self-awareness and a self-reflection on the part of the students too, that there's a difference between before, you know, if someone said, oh, this class has, you know, 10 quizzes, you know, a quiz every week, you know, and I'm sure a lot of students would have sort of groaned and said, oh, I hate quizzes. But, you know, Jake, you had mentioned earlier that these were actually really helpful if they were structured in a way that was sort of geared towards helping you sort of learn rather than feeling like you need to get the right answer. So there's a lot of things that this sort of situation has made instructors reflect on some of the practices that they were doing and why we're doing it, and hopefully in a way that will be focusing on the learning rather than testing or evaluating, as Kathy mentioned in the chat. Any other sort of comments that you guys have about some of the things that you'd like to see moving forward?
I thank you for asking the same question again, because I had a couple of things on my mind and I keep forgetting and felt uncomfortable to jump in and feel like I talk too much. But one thing that I think about before, I had a history class where it was really important. I had a lot of classes where it was really important to bring a physical copy of your paper. And my professor was so strict about it. There was no way around it. It seemed like it was either physical paper or nothing else was accepted. And that seems not relevant right now. We figured it out during the remote learning that professors, if they don't like to have screen while they're reading, that they can print out at their home or their office, and that UCLA would kind of, it seems to me that professors would have easier access to printers than students. And I was in a situation, a lot of times, every student is writing until the last moment, like, at least from my experience, I'm always like, oh, there was something I changed, and there was this reference that I wanted to add. And I felt like that last stress of printing that paper was so much pressure on something that is kind of not relevant anymore. So just wanted to point that out, and it's a very technical thing, but yeah, I hope we get more flexible in the future.
So,
go
ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to just say one thing that I would say going forward is the kind of availability of materials online and for review after. And, you know, some classes I remember, and I was a freshman a long time ago, but they were broadcasted, you know, so you could see the questions being asked and watch it later. And I think going forward, that would be great to have even when we're back in the classes, because you sit in lecture, you hear it, but then sometimes you're like, what was that one phrase? And exactly like Ivana said, if you missed it, writing it down, and you're a visual learner like me, it's helpful to be able to see it again. So having access to all of the materials in the way that we do now in this online world, I think would be great going forward.
Thank you. Kathy, you put a question on the chat. Do you want to ask the students the question?
Sure. I'm actually at UC Merced and I work in the Teaching and Learning Center. And we've talked a lot with faculty about creating like an introductory video to introduce the course and themselves. I'm just wondering if any of your faculty, in fact, used that strategy and how that impacted you.
Yeah, I can speak on this a little. So my faculty didn't necessarily do a video, but what they did do was like a presentation slide of like who they are. And it would kind of be like not just like about them as a professor, but where they come from, their kind of like identities. I really like that actually. I enjoy learning a little more about my professors, not just as like academics, but also as like people. There'd be like fun facts like what's their horoscope or other kind of like little details. I think help make the instructor more relatable for students, and it's easier to approach them. I think especially for student, or at least kind of my underclassmen friends who have been starting out this year, there is this kind of perception of being like intimidated by professors because like they're like so advanced in their fields. But those are kind of like more personal aspects through like welcome videos or welcome slides, I think help make it easier to approach them during office hours or to reach out over email. So I personally really enjoy it. I also really enjoy it when the professor takes the chance to, or takes a little bit of time in class to kind of get to know the students as well. Yeah.
Hi, Kathy. Thank you so much for your question. I would say I would personally prefer it to be like a live introduction, just so students have the opportunity to ask questions. I think it's a lot more interactive that way, and it helps build the community within the classroom. But that's just my take on it.
I want to jump in real quick. Yeah, both of what Jason and Lilia said were absolutely correct. I think it makes the professor a lot more relatable and makes it less intimidating to approach them. I think something that could be interesting though is maybe having the TAs record an introductory video. I notice a lot of times, at least for me personally, in my classes, I tend to kind of just stick toward my own TA just because they're the person I see for the entire quarter. And I don't really get to know any of the other TAs in the class that well. Just maybe it's a comfort thing, but I think maybe having them introduce themselves, what they do, just really quick. It doesn't have to be in lecture, possibly just like a pre-recorded video. We'll let students get to know them individually a lot better and really make them more comfortable, maybe reaching out to other TAs other than the one that teach their discussion sections as well.
That's a great idea, Jake. Yeah, I like that a lot. Anyone else?
Thanks, that's very helpful. Because I think some faculty are afraid to take time at the front, like use instructional time at the front end of a course to build this kind of community. But I think since we've gone into the remote environment, it really became a priority. And so I too also hope that that continues, because it is a way to kind of break down those barriers that are really false barriers in many cases. Faculty are real people, and we want to relate to you just like you want to relate to us. So thank you for your input.
I think Jason's question earlier too about, I meant a point about getting to know students as well. So not just the professor sharing, but creating that space, whether it's live during the first class or some kind of survey at the beginning. I think one of you mentioned that, kind of like asking students about their technology access. Or I think a lot of instructors have started doing that in the remote and maybe didn't think about doing it before. Some did. I think some have done those welcome surveys for a long time, but but hearing how much that meant for you and meant for your peers, I really hope that's a strategy people will continue to do going forward when we're back, in person, is really trying to get to know their students and build some of that kind of shared commitment to how we want to learn and work together at the beginning of the quarter. And like you said, Kathy, taking time in class to do that, but that's not a waste of instructional time to kind of build those relationships.
Adrian, you had a question that do you want to ask panelists?
Sure. I was thinking, we've been hearing a lot about what instructors did during the pandemic that they might want to take into the future, but what about you as students? Did you learn new ways of studying or learning that you personally will use in the future?
Besides of learning that there's no excuses for me anymore to be late for class. I'm always late, and a lot of people in my department became so accepted that we're all like 10 minutes late to class, and then I get into my regular classes that are not part of the major, and it's like, whoa, a lot happened in these 10 minutes. So yeah, I learned that actually there is actually like very little excuses, as like besides of some extreme family situations, but yeah, besides of getting in your pajama and getting on the screen and that kind of thing, yeah, traffic is not relevant anymore. So that was really a wake-up call for me. Then I can mention another thing. It's more about learning how, this is not super relevant to online learning only, but I learned how much I learned from other students, not just from my professors, but from the students who sit next to me in a classroom. So we would copy from each other, like especially in studio classes. I was mentioning this, that like, even just doing like small projects and making small things, and professor would show it and it seems so easy, and then you get your 10 minutes to do the same thing, and it's like so difficult to glue two pieces of wood together. It's just so incredibly difficult all of a sudden, and then you see your classmate figuring out before you, and you're just like, hey, do you mind just showing me? I'm stuck here. And you don't have to go to kind of authority, no matter how professor is accessible, you don't have to do that extra step. And you can just copy and see from, and now it's gone. So I wish that that kind of moment still exists online, or I miss it when it was in person.
Yeah, I think I can add on that point. I think I definitely agree with kind of online learning. I think I've learned, at least personally, like kind of, or my study habits have definitely become more group study based. So I think it's just a matter of like, it being easier to set up like study groups, at least for me, like online, like it's just like easy to hop on a Zoom instead of like setting up a place and a time for everyone. And I think that has really allowed me to have more discussion opportunities with my peers. Whereas before, maybe I was more limited to like kind of seminars or discussion sections. And that's really helped, I think, in terms of how I view my own like kind of assignments in class as more so like communal learning as opposed to just like, individual like assessment. And I think that is something that I really value from my experience of going online, at least, and I'm hoping to continue on once we're in person.
I love your point, Jason. This is Kathy, about communal learning. That really is sort of very significant in a lot of cultures, that it's not so independent. And I think our system here in the States is very independent oriented, and we're just probably in the last decade have moved to more a better understanding of this importance of collaboration and working in groups, because that's more real world for many people. So I like that, communal learning.
Chris, you have your hand up? both physically and the little
Yeah,
icon?
So, because I don't trust the digits. But anyway, put the digits in digital. Anyway, so I'd like to follow up on that communal and this idea of the world that you live in to learn, because it's not just students and teachers, it's students and family members. And that was kind of a double-edged sword from my conversations with several of my students. So I was wondering whether you feel like your family now better understands and perhaps supports your efforts at higher education, or whether you found that the boundaries grew impassable and can't wait to get back to campus. Appreciate your candor.
Anyone want to jump in?
I'm still laughing about that question because just like reflecting on like situations from like the last couple of months. It's really the situation is very different. So I don't live with my parents, I live with my boyfriend, and we're both UCLA students full time. And there is bedroom and there's this like office kind of space that we have. And it's a luxury, like a lot of people don't have that. But it's always a fight who's gonna get what space and who has more important things to do. And classes are usually at the same time. So and we have a dog too that would jump between our rooms and ask for things. So it is embarrassing. A lot of times I couldn't turn on my camera because my dog was jumping all over me, and like I was just not feeling comfortable about that. And then there was a lot of times that like it's just like things are getting like it's not as easy as being in a class and not thinking about all this world around you. You can kind of zoom out of everything and focus on just the PowerPoint of your professor. But right now it's impossible. So, and yeah, the question of like, do I feel like that reflects on my work, and is my family or my like surrounding more aware of that and appreciate it more? I'm not sure, honestly. So I talked to my parents that live in Serbia in Eastern Europe, and I'm telling them that I had like 4-hour Zoom class about one topic, and they're like, we can't believe that it's like 4 hours to do one little thing. So it's still not close to them. And yeah, it's a lot of times it's like funny situations and fun. Yeah, I love that cat. Funny situation, little things that happen throughout the day that are just making this a different experience.
Yes, Adrian's cat is well known in her class, and they asked for her, correct?
The animals don't appear until we start our work.
No, yeah, kind of on the point of that this kind of question also has reminded me, one of my professors, kind of a fun rule, I guess, that she implemented in class. Whenever someone mentions their pet, or like we see a pet in the camera, they have to bring it up and show it to everyone. I think that's just because like I feel like when we're the one with like something going on in our camera, we're kind of like embarrassed, especially like with a pet. But it's always nice, I think, at least for me personally, like when I see someone's pet, I really like love it because it helps liven up the Zoom call. And then I guess to the point of like parents and like experience with like kind of living with other folks while taking online classes. I would say that my parents definitely have like started questioning me about like why like my schedule is so like packed all the time with classes. I think they never just registered the like rigor of like how many classes we have to take. I will say that even though they know it's busy, they still do kind of still pop in, like they'll open the doors like kind of unannounced. I would say like instead of them getting used to me like kind of on my own, I have to get used to them like getting on the Zoom. But I think something that this kind of speaks to is in terms of like the instructor side, it would, and like other students even, I think you know, not, so I guess like trying to help make that situation not so awkward for the students. I know like for me, I get embarrassed sometimes when my parents come in, but like, you know, when I really appreciate when instructors will like acknowledge that, and, or even just like kind of like, you know, not make it into a situation of like, oh, like something's going on, but like recognizing that's something that just kind of happens in the background. Not calling it out especially is important. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, it definitely is something that I wasn't thinking about, but yeah, it happens a lot.
And I'll tell you what, the new thing about this environment, frankly, is that it's happening in the personal space of our students and ourselves. We are, as we never do when we go to the neutral site of UCLA, we are sharing each other's personal space. With whatever you're seeing me behind, you know, and I can create that stupid digital background, but at the same time, I think that there's a lot of positive to it, to this deal, but there's a risk, there's a vulnerability. You know, I mean, there's some things about me I frankly don't want my students to see, and I'm sure that the feeling is mutual. So it can really be an awkward situation, and part of that personal is that my family is here. My family's around here, and so I think that's part of the empathy that has grown up too, is that faculty members have become more aware that students, oh my God, they have family, because now I have to be cognizant of my kid running in naked from the bath in front of all my students and stuff. So I hope there's a greater appreciation all around that we live 360-degree lives too, and I hope we carry that forward. I hope we can go like, you know, just being here in this monastic space of UCLA where we forget about everything else that makes us human. No. Let's bring that with us. Let's be cognizant that we have families, we have children, we have brothers and sisters. Yeah.
Anyone else want to jump in or add to that? Or other questions? Okay, so I think we have, I do not want to butcher your name.
Sushma.
Sushma, yes.
Yes. Would you like to ask your questions to the panelists?
Yes, thank you. This is Sushma, and my question is in terms of technology readiness. Were there helpful resources that got you ready for your online learning environment? And as you think of the new normal, would there be any resources that would be helpful for you?
One thing that I personally really liked are having either class GroupMe's or class Slacks. So GroupMe is usually mainly just students versus the time that I've had Slack, it's with the professor as well. And it's really nice because you can send direct messages within that like class Slack, or you can make groups for your group projects. And it also makes it easier and less intimidating to contact the professors or the TAs, because it's just a Slack message versus a very professional and slightly intimidating email. So I definitely think creating that line of communication is very helpful. One of my classes has begun to use CampusWire to post discussion questions and to get responses instead of CCUE. And I also find that that's been very effective and helpful.
Thank you.
I would also add, in terms of like physical items, I think all of our computers have shortened their lifespans just by us being on Zoom all the time. Like I'll be in probably 20 minutes, my computer is going to start fan whirring and everything. But definitely, I think when we return back to in person, having access to technology, whether it be laptops, and the UCLA library did a really great job of shipping that stuff out all quick notice, and the Wi-Fi, definitely I miss UCLA Wi-Fi, because at home I have like a brother on Zoom, my mom's on Zoom, so it's like, but I think that's a huge thing that to be aware of is that technology wise, in terms of hardware, Wi-Fi, access to different programs, that's going to be huge. And so I look forward to hopefully seeing an expansion of that, because I know in the School of Engineering, they have a few computer labs, but once those get packed, it's like you have to just wait or stay on campus super late. So I'm interested to see how we can go forward with those technologies.
That's a great point. Thank you.
Thank you. We are a little over an hour into this panel. I know that it is long. We don't want to Zoom fatigue you, but I also do want to make sure that I give you the opportunity to the first of the panelists, if there's anything else you want to share, your thoughts that you hadn't been able to share so far. Let's start from there, and then I'll make sure that we have no lingering questions from the audience. So panelists, is there something that we haven't covered yet?
I think one thing I'll add in terms of Zoom is, yes, thank you. One thing I'll add is that I feel that as we've transitioned onto Zoom, there's been a greater emphasis in terms of like learning accessibility, particularly like, on Zoom through the use of closed captions, and even with our like, presentation slides, making them visibly accessible for students. And I think that that is something I hope we can continue to talk about. Of course, we'll have to adapt to like an in-person environment. But I think working closely with like the Center for Accessible Education, and also I'm thinking about how to make these different resources or class materials accessible to students with different abilities, I think is really important to continue to think about beyond Zoom.
Absolutely, thank you. Anyone else?
I can, my last kind of note, I feel like while, the last year has been really, there's no adjective, I think it's in a positive way, it's been empowering for students, because we've gotten to a point where it's like, we have to speak up and not control the narrative, but be able to contribute in ways that I think when we were before the pandemic, we kind of just sat in lecture and took notes and then went away. But now, as we've talked about all this afternoon, the professors are people, we are people. So I think that's been a huge kind of benefit of the online learning. And so I'm looking forward when we go back, to seeing more of a dialogue and having kind of open communication, because I think what we've learned is that there's so many different ways to learn. And it's important that we're able to encompass all of that, kind of piggybacking off of what Jason just said, like making it so that all of us, when we leave UCLA or, continue on, that we've learned so much and are ready to keep going.
Thank you. Okay, so Kathy had
Comito, I was just gonna ask, there's some best practices out there that argue that faculty, lectures should be, if they're recorded, maybe 5 to 7 minutes. And some students don't like all the, having 40 different videos to go through. But what would you say, from your experience, would be like the perfect length before you start tuning out for a video lecture?
I think for me, I have had both, like just professors who would just post their entire Zoom lecture on Zoom for however many days a week. And I've also had professors who used to split it up into a bunch of different videos. Personally, I would say that I would say a longer video, I think, is better for me personally. I feel like sometimes when professors kind of chunk their videos into separate sections, it's hard to keep track of the amount of time that you might actually be lecturing. And I felt like in my broken down class, my professor would actually go over their allotted, or not allotted, but like the scheduled class time quite often during the quarter. And for me, that was a little frustrating because it felt like I was, doing more work than what the university kind of specified would be necessary to take the course. I think when you do like a longer lecture, you may be more accustomed or like more susceptible to Zoom fatigue, but I think, the professors have an easier time kind of like looking and keeping track of how much time they're going over, and kind of keeping within like the time constraints, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
I want to add to this point and also answer your question, Katty, because I was thinking like a lot of times in a class you have 40 minutes for lecture, let's say, for example, but that 40 minutes is not only for lecture. A lot of times it's interruptions, students have questions and things like that. So lecture time is not equivalent to 40 minutes of professor recording themselves in home. It seems to me that when I have to watch like 1 hour videos, I'm already like, when you can play a video and see how long it is, you're already like, I really have to do this, and kind of get discouraged from that beginning. And I don't like that, because sometimes a lecture can be even an hour and a half, and like you get into it by the time you're there. But although you can make people not see how long is your lecture, it helps like keeping your lectures, I know sometimes it's impossible, but keeping them as short as possible for the recorded ones, and then going deeper in person to kind of go back to some things that were maybe a little too fast and kind of explain them a little further. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just to add on to what Jake and Ivana said, I agree with Jake that it's easier, at least for me, to have one long video and watch at my own pace. So maybe if I've been watching it for an hour and it's a 2-hour video, I want to take a break, I can just pause it, step away, do whatever I want to do, and then come back to it. Versus it might seem a little bit intimidating if there are 5 videos and they're each 20 minutes in length. In my head, I might just see more and be like, wow, I have a lot more work. The only time I'd like highly recommend having a bunch of videos instead of one would be if they're all on very specific objectives within the lecture, because then it helps break down like this topic, here's a video on that, here's another topic. Other than that, I think it's easier in terms of organization to just have one recording.
Can I really quickly?
Okay. Imani, go ahead.
I'm kind of on the opposite side. I prefer like 10 short videos but I also know my learning style from the pandemic has been, I like to rewatch things multiple times. And if I have to like search in the 2-hour lecture or 60-minute lecture for like 3 minutes of a talk, that seems more work for me. So on the other side, I think when they're shorter, it's easier to review them multiple times. But I just wanted to bring that up because, both sides. Sorry, Kumiko.
No. I was just gonna say that you all bring up really interesting points. I would have, personally, I would have recommended to faculty shorter, because my assumption was that, if you do shorter, they're more planned and you have you don't go on and on. But that's an assumption that I probably made, and that's not always necessarily true. So I think that what you're all saying is that really it's about planning and thinking, what you're sort of saying, and more so than necessarily sort of the length of the video. Can you find it? Is it organized in a way that makes sense? But if not, it's better to sort of make sure that you have sort of that time and be mindful of what you're doing. So
I do think I'm hearing too, Kamiko, that sense of like well organized. So if it was going to be smaller chunks, that those chunks be logically sort of distinct from one another, and there be a reason that there's a break. I know some instructors would sometimes even drop an activity between, or like a practice quiz or things like that do like, okay, we mastered this concept, now go on to the next sort of video and the next concept. And that if they're structured in that way, then it might make sense for them to be broken up. but maybe in some other cases it wouldn't be. And I do think that the point Jake and others made about not ending up with more recorded material than the live class would have taken is something that I think it is really important for instructors to bear in mind. And then I know at the beginning of the pandemic, we were all new to this too. I mean, the faculty were as well. They didn't really know how long it was going to take them to record something in their house for whatever reason, either with more interruptions or fewer interruptions. And sometimes it did result in significantly more content to watch than they would have had, students would have had to experience if they were coming to class live, and especially if there was also a live component for the class to kind of complement or extend the lecture, like Ivana, you were describing, like, let's go in more depth, come to this like live meeting, then suddenly that's sort of twice the meetings because you just watched, you know, a 90-minute lecture and now you're coming to a 90-minute discussion. So recognizing how to kind of integrate those different opportunities for learning together in a way that still covers the content that needs to be covered and provides the engagement that will help students retain that, but doesn't overwhelm anybody with more than they signed up for.
Okay, well, any other questions or any other comments from everyone? Well, I want to say, and I'm sure everyone here feels the same way. Thank you so much for the panelists for their time and sharing their thoughts and experiences. We really, really appreciate it. And as it says here, we learned a lot, and I think it's always important to hear the voices of the students, and thank you so much for sharing.
Great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Okay, I'm off to class now. I have to incorporate all of your suggestions.
So I'm going to stop the recording right now.